Good morning and welcome to the latest in our series of Hume Brophy's interviews about Britain's political and economic future. My name is Mark McGregor, and you'll have to excuse my lack of voice for this morning, and I'm chairing the event today. I remember when we first pitched the idea of an event to our three panelists. It was some point during the leadership election. I think we all imagined then that we'd be discussing the first few weeks of the Liz Truss-led government, what she's planning on tax cuts, supply side reforms, maybe some stuff about the pressures on the NHS, and then how the kind of new cabinet were planning out to deliver on her election promises. And I do recall at about the same time, there were even some pollsters who were predicting that Liz Truss might get some kind of polling bounce and might therefore be tempted to go for an early election. Well, we do seem to be in a rather different position now, and I'm not sure. I mean, I've seen political chaos in my lifetime, but I'm not sure any of our panelists could possibly imagine such a reversal of fortunes over such a short period of time. There's obviously a high likelihood that this political turbulence, if we call it that, of the past few weeks is likely to continue. But rather than focus on the fate of Liz Truss and her government, which might have days, weeks, or maybe even hours left. What I was hoping to do today was to kind of focus on a more interesting discussion about the future of the Conservative government. That, after all, is the title of the event. And I'm just hoping that, as I've been on various calls and meetings where I've had to announce political developments over the last few days, I'm just hoping that the politics in Westminster can actually be put on hold for the duration of this discussion. So the title of today's discussion is "What is the future of the Conservative government?" Which, again, applying all the caveats that you never know what might be around the corner, does seem at least likely to be in power for the next couple of years. As I said, rather than speculating about the future of the PM, I thought it'd be interesting to look at what the Conservative government can, or indeed should be aiming to deliver against what is an incredibly difficult and tough economic backdrop. Looking at what the announcements over the last few days, what the Chancellor's said is it looks as if it's going to get tougher in the months ahead. And to help with that discussion, we've invited three expert minds with experience at the highest level of politics, who I hope can today apply the kind of lessons that they learned inside different governments to the current challenges. The first is Danny Finkelstein, Lord Finkelstein, Times columnist. I'm sure you've all read his columns, brilliant one this week, advisor to William Hague, David Cameron, and chair of, or ex-chair of, a number of think tanks where I last worked with him. And then, of course, the author of a number of books, including what seems like the aptly titled book, Everything in Moderation. Second is Rachel Wolfe, who co-authored the last Conservative Manifesto with, I think, Robert Colville. But boy, does that manifesto seem a long time ago. And she also led the New Schools Network, the organisation that helped hundreds of free schools set up around the country. And prior to that, she was a special advisor on innovation and education in Number 10. So brings that direct experience of being inside government. And finally, to kick off the discussion, Nick Timothy. Nick is a columnist at the Daily Telegraph, also a director at New Schools Network. I should sort of add, just for clarity, that he managed to get selected for that job ahead of me, so he's obviously got some exceptional talents. And he again served as special advisor both in the Home Office for Theresa May and then as Joint Chief of Staff at Number 10. So before handing over to Nick, then Rachel, then Danny, in that order, one piece of housekeeping. So the discussion will kick off with some opening thoughts for 3 to 4 minutes from each panelist. I'll try and then moderate a discussion, and then we'll ask for some questions from the audience. So if you want to make a point or ask a question, can you post it in the chat, and I'll try to keep a notification of which one's coming through, and I'll try to put those on your behalf. So thank you very much for the three panelists for agreeing to take part today. I've got a very large audience. Nick, perhaps you can kick us off.
Thanks, Mark. And you did a really good job of demonstrating how terribly incestuous Westminster and the Tory party is, I think. But I'm very happy to be sharing a virtual stage with you all. You're all good friends. Obviously, we could spend all day talking about what is happening in the Tory party right now, and that is actually relevant because what we're talking about is about how the Conservative Party tries to put itself back together again, and offer the country good government and give itself a fighting chance at the next election, which will be very difficult after the events of the last few weeks. And I think it is. I think it does feel like it is a case of hours and days left for the PM. So so I think for those of you with two screens, I suggest you keep one on this debate and one on a news channel and a Twitter feed, because God knows what will happen in the next 45 minutes or so. So where does it all leave the party now? Well, I think the debates of the last few weeks and actually to some degree the debates during the leadership campaign itself have presented the choices that are available to the party as between deficit-funded tax cutting by people quite excited and drunk on libertarian ideology, and something that is a bit more like the austerity that we had earlier in the period of Conservative-led government back in the coalition between 2010 and 15, that will see taxes rise and spending cut. Unfortunately, mostly because of the budget, a correction of that kind is needed, just as austerity was needed back in 2010-15. And there's no point, as you increasingly see some Conservatives doing, complaining about policy being dictated by those you borrow from. If you're dependent on the bond markets, then basically you can't get on the wrong side of them, and that is why the budget, with the fiscal hole it created, was very dangerous. You can complain about, you can talk about global factors like the decisions of the Fed in America, which is sucking credit out of the international system, or you can talk about LDIs by the pension funds. But basically, these lines, to me, only really justify why the budget was so reckless, that you have to be cautious in contexts like those. But to me, beyond the correction, we need to try to analyze what's wrong with our economy and what we should do. So it's not just it's not actually about things like the overall tax take, which actually remains low by European standards, especially when you take into account the fact that we have a nationalized health service, and which we will have to accept will remain high because of demographics caused by the aging population and the shocks that we've been paying extraordinary sums of money for, like the pandemic and the energy crunch. But the real problems we face are about poor productivity, regional disparities, our unsustainable trade deficits. So we need a new approach based on some of the Boris people would say that this is what he was trying to do, but I don't think he got very far, based on active government, long-term investment, economic rebalancing, skills and training, domestic production, because basically we're not as rich as we think we are. That's what inflation tells us. That's what pay stagnation tells us, the trade deficit, the state of the public finances. We've got extraordinary levels of personal debt. I think the statistics show that it stands at 133% of total household income. Our model is dependent on consumption, but we have far too many people who are too poor to consume without credit. We've basically run down the sectors of the economy that are good at creating mid-skilled, mid-paid jobs and exports. And instead, we've got this kind of like barbell labor market with people doing well at one end and lots of people being forced into low-skilled, low-paid work at the other. And the problem with the unbalanced economy is that it means you have fewer exports, you have a trade deficit. Sorry, my phone's going haywire because of events. You have fewer exports, you have a huge trade deficit, and that creates these perverse outcomes. So to protect the currency, we need a lot of foreign capital. So companies and assets like housing stock, like the utilities, get sold off. That helps to create a kind of vicious cycle. So good, promising companies are sold before they grow to a certain size. That affects R&D. R&D spend is kept low. The utilities can profiteer without investing. Look at the water companies. And asset prices are kept up. So basically, my view is we need to go through the pain of a correction now, but where we really need to head is economic growth through a rebalanced economy. And that means everything from education policy to immigration, fiscal and monetary policy to energy, industrial strategy, the regulation of labour markets, the supply of housing needs to be directed at achieving that objective.
Thank you very much. Just before I come to Rachel, obviously there's can any of that be done reasonably in 2 years, I guess would be the biggest challenge.
Yeah, well, I think the thing is, as I say, it's going to be very difficult to do plenty of things over a time period like 2 years. We basically, I think, we do have to have this fiscal correction. But there's a lot that the party can do to demonstrate a sense of direction, I think. So on supply side reforms, there are some things that those who want a smaller state and to deregulate, where they might actually have a point. So within reason, we need to do things to our planning system to show that things can be can get built sooner, faster, better. One of the ways in which I think we can achieve some of these things that won't cost lots and lots of money is by having quite a dramatic shift when it comes to decentralization. Now, that doesn't mean obviously you can just simply transfer lots of things right now, but you can set off that that work now so that the direction is set and people can understand what it is you're trying to achieve.
Okay, Rachel.
Thank you, and predictably, Nick has stolen much of what I was going to say, but I will try and focus on a couple of things. So if we're talking about what the Conservative government needs to do in the next 2 years and how they need to think about it, I think the first thing is they need to rediscover their voters. I think the thing that was most astonishing to me during the leadership election this summer and the consequent decisions made by Liz Truss is how little the Conservative Parliamentary Party, or much of it, seemed to have internalised who their voters were and what they voted for in 2019. And broadly, that is two sets of kind of coalitions. I'm oversimplifying, but it is a remarkable percentage of the traditional kind of Cameron Conservative voter who cared about fiscal discipline, did care about the most vulnerable. This was kind of the classic Cameron view, wanted stable government, what we often now call the blue wall, to the extent that exists. And then the second were poorer, more Northern and Midlands voters who wanted more investment in public spending, actually never been particularly convinced by austerity or the deficit, although they want, fundamentally credible government, and who had voted for Brexit because they wanted to see change. They felt let down. I think the challenge that the government obviously has now, I mean, it is beyond obvious that none of these people, indeed no one in the country, is libertarian Reaganite, but we've all moved beyond that, is that they do not actually have a mandate from that electoral coalition for what they are now forced to do, which is large amounts of spending reductions and probably tax rises, and that this is completely taking that public by surprise. I think there was actually a moment post-COVID, and indeed in the midst of the energy crisis, where you could have said to the public, because they were primed for it, this cost a hell of a lot of money. We are in a weaker situation because of it. We're going to have to make some tough decisions. But that argument was never made. And so this kind of grown-up Hunt Osborneite agenda, which may be necessary, has neither expectation nor mandate among this electorate. And the traditional Conservative kind of group that originally voted for this are generally quite annoyed about Brexit and aren't scared by Keir Starmer. So I think it is very hard, bluntly, to see where this coalition comes from. It is probably easier, given where we are now, and I hate to say this because I care desperately about the Middle England group that 2019 got. It is probably easier now to return to the kind of core Conservative vote, but that in itself is not easy. So that's the kind of counsel of despair. But to move on to the sort of what can one do? I think probably most of us on this call who got into politics partly because we cared about domestic reform and things like free schools and school reform have been quite depressed that since 2016, we've mostly been in domestic policy paralysis through a combination of our own problems and things constantly hitting us. And spending reviews are very bad for this because the entirety of Whitehall shuts down and spends its time playing games with the Treasury, offering up completely unpalatable cuts, and they go back and forth. And the kind of classic thing that everyone who's been in government has seen, which is nothing productive happens in spending reviews, is happening yet again. If I were in government, though, and to pick up on what Nick was saying, I think what I would be spending my time doing is identifying areas where, one, there is some hope of a progress that can be made across parliaments and indeed across parties. I think the most obvious of those to me are devolution. If you still care about like the Treasury orthodoxy problem and productivity, then broadly your only serious plan to deal with that is to devolve. Two, skills. I think the skill reforms of this government have been the only significant domestic reform that's happened. The lifelong learning entitlement, which gives everyone a chance to retrain. It's the beginnings of a sort of plan that you could imagine Labour had to add to. And three, energy infrastructure and demand. It is staggering to me that we're still having to talk about this. You remember there were these supply side reforms we were supposed to have. Like, we desperately need more domestic energy infrastructure of all kinds. And we need to be telling people how to reduce energy demand. It's ludicrous that we're planning for blackouts and we're not telling people how to reduce their energy demand. It's insanity. These are things you can do despite having complete parliamentary chaos and no mandate. So I suppose that is a way of saying it is not obvious where their next coalition comes from, if anywhere. They are going to have to make a choice and they're going to have to try and decide which of those they want to go for. Red wall, I think, is now very, very hard. But they don't have to leave in 2 years having achieved nothing. And there are things that they can still do which start to demonstrate that they are a serious government again. And I think the paralysis of this kind of spending review and sort of austerity agenda needs to be conquered if they're going to have a hope of keeping anything. Wasn't that optimistic of me?
We didn't necessarily want optimism, but we wanted some reality. Danny.
So thank you. I very much agree with both those comments, and that's a more interesting statement than it sounds. So Mark obviously selected us to come from certain different perspectives, but what he didn't do was to select batshit mad people who are completely delusional and start to talk about globalist conspiracies overthrowing the legitimate head of the government and things like that, which definitely is a strand on the right at the moment. So we're inclined to agree partly for that because we don't belong to that outlying tradition, but secondly for an even more interesting reason, which is that the one bit of Rachel's presentation which I thought was too pessimistic, the rest I thought was completely correctly pessimistic, was that I don't actually think the choice between these different audiences is that sharp. I think people are not very political. They want prosperity. They want a broad prosperity. They want competent government. They do not want mad ideological experiments of any kind. Even that they're suspicious of governments which are very ideological, even about things where they agree with them. So, for example, it may be that if you pressed everybody, they might be uncomfortable about Premier League footballers taking the knee, in theory, but they possibly wouldn't like the Home Secretary to make a big political issue out of it, even though they agreed with her. It's a very odd combination of instincts, and it therefore ends that, despite our slightly different nuances and the fact that I'd be more complimentary about George Osborne than Nick would be, that I am much more sceptical about the kind of aim for this whole new audience than Rachel is. All three of us basically think we need that libertarianism is a total dead end, both intellectually and politically, that people don't want it, that we have to, that funding decent public services has to be paid for, that tax cuts don't pay for themselves, that we need to understand the kind of basic small c conservative instincts of the British people, which unites Nick and I's view on immigration, for instance, and which unites Rachel and I on all sorts of levelling up and public spending priorities. And you know, we may differ in the way that we describe it as red wall conservatism, or as, you know, Erdington conservatism, or you know, we might think, or I would call it, you know, kind of centrist liberal conservatism. But actually, in fact, we're talking about pretty much the same range of policies. And part of it is that the problems, that the solutions may vary, but the problems are not set by the government. The problems are set by Britain's situation. Nick's right, low productivity is absolutely crucial. Liz Truss wasn't wrong to talk about that, but it's obviously ridiculous to suggest that a range of unfunded tax cuts is going to increase productivity, right? There's absolutely no empirical evidence to suggest that would happen at all. And so, you know, one of the things that I was asked to do is sort of say to Liz Truss, what would you do now? If that was 24 hours ago, and the situation I think is much worse for her now than it was. But 24 hours ago, I said, don't drop the growth agenda, but just make sure that there's more to it than tax cuts, since you can't do those things. I think any government faces a problem when it goes into a general election if growth isn't increasing, and that doesn't necessarily need to be their fault. I always used to say about Boris Johnson, he may get away with the things that are his fault, but he may end up losing office for things that are not his fault. As it happens, he went over something that was his fault. That's a whole different thing. But the Conservative government, you know, I think that I'll finish with one thing that I think an unappreciated feature of Rishi Sunak's resignation was that it wasn't actually over parties. It was over his difference of opinion with Boris Johnson over precisely the same issue that Liz Truss has just gone into, which is, can the Conservative Party simultaneously increase spending on various things everyone agrees is necessary, both for our future prosperity and for the kind of future cohesion and public service provision of the country? Can it do those things and at the same time have its traditional massive tax cutting policy? And it just can't. Reality dictates that it can't. And Boris Johnson and Liz Truss both believe that it can. And in some ways, it's unfortunate it came crashing down under Liz, because if it had under Boris, it might be even more obvious what the problem was. The Conservative Party cannot go in two directions. It cannot take on board, I think, Nick's correct adjustment of the Conservative message in the 2017 election and the 2017 manifesto, its correct explanation that it's not a libertarian party. It cannot do that and simultaneously retain its kind of sweeping tax cut policy, because the two things don't add up. And that's what's now happened. But it would have happened, I think, if Boris had replaced Rishi with another chancellor. Indeed, the first thing that Nadhim Zahawi said when he was appointed chancellor under Boris was, before Boris had to resign too, was that this would enable them to cut taxes. They were proposing exactly the same policy, which would have had the same result.
Okay, thank you. So is exploring that then, is the thesis that just interested because I know Rachel does some polling, is the thesis that the Conservatives cannot win, almost certainly can't win in 2 years, and therefore but if they at least demonstrate competence for that period, they might begin to restore some sense that the party is not a basket case.
That's me.
Yeah.
I think it's almost impossible for the Conservatives to win in 2 years now, which seems extraordinary given where it was a year ago. It cannot win with this Prime Minister. I think that the public have made up its mind. But yes, I think it can choose how it goes out and for how long. And it can also choose what kind of government it is. It could even potentially, maybe in an optimistic scenario, be in a position where Labour don't form an outright majority. But yes, I think that is correct.
And do we think, I'm going back to the point that you were making, Rachel, I think the others have, oh, by the way, yes, it was true. I did try to invite people who wouldn't necessarily agree. But yes, I probably wasn't going to ever.
We can come back to that and talk about what Osborne got wrong, if you like.
Yeah, another day. Is just going back to the coalition. I mean, it's like a unique coalition of people that voted Conservative. Some have never voted Conservative before, and obviously there's a kind of Corbyn Brexit part of that. But is the problem that it was never going to be possible for the Conservatives to hold that together? Is that really the problem that whether it's Boris or Liz Truss that has been trying to tackle?
No, I don't.
No, I don't agree with that.
Sorry, I don't think that's right. No, go on. Sorry, Danny, you go first.
No, I don't agree. So let's while we can concentrate on long-term trends and the coalition and its different requirements, one of the things that everybody wants is a prime minister that's basically competent. And the Conservative Party has chosen 2 prime ministers in a row who are unsuitable for that role. Boris Johnson, unlike Liz Truss, I think, is a brilliantly talented individual with an amazing reach and a unique political style, and it's just unfortunate that he couldn't combine that with some degree of an acceptance of the kind of restraints of holding high office and behave in a way that was suitable for that, either in his application or in his management of staff or his way of behaving. Then the Conservative Party set about choosing somebody who was patently, completely plainly not capable of doing the job. In 2016, after Liz Truss had made her pork disastrous speech, I actually helped her write a 2016 conference speech because I thought Liz Truss, I like her a lot, and I also thought she kind of had gently liberal views, and she was interested in maths, and I thought maybe this was somebody, do you know what I mean? And I thought to myself, well, this is the sort of realistic person. Sure, I'll happily help you. And the truth is, when she gave this speech, it wasn't a bad script, but it was a disastrous performance. And I looked at it, the idea at that point that this was somebody who would, I thought the minimum things, could this person stay in the cabinet, not can they be prime minister? So the Conservative Party, of course it can hold together quite a broad coalition if it has, competent leadership instituting mainstream policies. It's always difficult after you've been there for years, but Labour's not very popular. And I think Keir Starmer was eminently beatable. He won't be beaten now, but he was eminently beatable.
I agree with that.
And Rachel, just on that?
Yeah, and then should I come on? I mean, the way I always thought about this is that the 2019 manifesto managed to appear to be a first-term manifesto, even though it was a fourth-term Conservative government. It sort of had this reset about it, which you might think is more appearance than substantive, but it did. When you get to these kind of second-term manifestos, what they always have to be is, we started the job, now trust us to finish it. It has to be, we have a record, we've gone along this journey, and now you need to stick with it. And was it going to be an 80-seat majority? No. Could it have been a majority? Absolutely. I'm kind of keen to come back at some point to this point Danny made, that they're not that different, which I half agree with and half don't. But I think it was completely conceivable, and people, a year ago were in despair that Starmer was making no headway. So no, this was not inevitable. It was possible to keep it together to an extent. It was possible to win another term. It now, I think, is not.
So I get the point about competence, and obviously in the current climate, it's demonstrating competence. I mean, it's a pretty low bar we've established at the moment. Having a week where one of your cabinet ministers doesn't resign, or some other disaster happens in the House or outside, that doesn't seem to be, it wouldn't be that tricky to get above that. But are there, come to sort of Nick, are there kind of practical policies? Because one of the problems is that, the impression that the country's got the impression, they kind of worked out, they looked at her, first impression not good. Even if a new leader were to come in, they've sort of established that's what they think, and changing that is going to be incredibly difficult. And so I accept the point about competence, but isn't one of the problems that if because of all the constraints on expenditure and the probably unwillingness of the Conservative members of Parliament to do some of the things we might have touched on. Isn't the problem that you simply aren't going to get any credit for that? You'll get a little bit of credit because you're not the shambles that we have now. But surely the problem is no one's going to notice it unless there are some significant improvements. Nick, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the big challenge because, as Danny said, people don't spend all their time obsessing about politics. So they won't be thinking, well, on my sort of matrix of the characteristics of Jeremy Hunt or Rishi Sunak or whoever it's going to be, that this represents a clear departure from the leadership of Liz Truss. It's going to be the Tories who have been screwing things up because of these kind of weird ideological and incompetent decisions. And then, whatever happens under whoever replaces Liz, we're going to be in for quite a painful time. And interest rates were going to go up, but they weren't going to go up as high and as quickly as they will now, thanks to the decisions that Liz and Kwasi took. But politically, that's irrelevant because that budget will become the defining moment of this Parliament, and the Labour Party will hang it around the necks of every Tory, whatever they thought about it. And that's life and that's politics. And I think one of the other problems is, as Rachel just said, as you come to a new election when you've been in power for a while, it's the message is basically so much achieved, so much more still to do. Stick with us. And what is it that we'll be able to achieve? Because what is it we'll be able to say we've achieved? Because the changes that have taken place from leader to leader over the last 12 years, and by the next election will have been 14 years, one supposes, have suited the party at times, because we've been able to be the change from our own mixed record in the way that the Labour Party couldn't, and we've kind of ridden this kind of realignment of voters. But when it comes to the next election, in terms of looking back to describe what we've done and who it is we are, it's a mess. And if we lose the next election and we try to make sense of our record and what it is we need to be honest about that we got wrong, and how it is that we need to change, you might be able to single out, say, school reform. That was good. You might be able to say, some people might say, well, we got Brexit done, but half the country hate it. Some people in the party hate it. And let's be honest, it was a very messy process involving, quite a lot of tactical setbacks and failures along the way. Some people might be able to say, or might want to say, well, we solved Labour's debt crisis back in 2010-15, but then we kind of created our own. It's basically it's a very difficult story to tell. So it's going to be very difficult. But I think where that leaves you is you have to do the kind of things we've been talking about. You have to show that actually the next election isn't the most important thing in the world. The most important thing in the world is governing the country well and looking out for people and being on their side and showing that you actually like the people who you're asking to vote for you, which is a bit of a problem for some people in the party.
Look, the biggest thing the party's done in this Parliament is leave the European Union. If it's going to make sense of the last few years, it has to make sense somehow of this. And I'm then at a bit of a loss. I'm not quite sure how to do that. And part of the problem is that if you look at what the point of Brexit was, it was to allow us to depart from the European social model. But the three of us are not sure we actually want to do that, right? So I don't have. That is, to my mind, the only thing that the party have to say. You'd have to say we left the European Union. It was a very bumpy process, and now we're trying to, So I think that's why I think you'd have to probably have a next leader has to be someone who's supported Brexit and kind of knows what to do with it. But I don't, I actually don't know what that is, because I didn't support Brexit because I didn't know what it was before. So I have to leave it to those, to other people to say.
Can I seize on this as an opportunity for some disagreement? Because so for some Tories who share the ideology of the kind of ideology that brought us into trouble with the budget, Brexit was about departing from the European social model. But as a Leaver myself, it emphatically wasn't about that for me, and I don't think it was about that for most people who voted Leave. And I know that's not what I was saying, Danny.
That's true. Yeah.
So I think the story is actually not about, do we make use of our freedoms by becoming less European and more American or Singaporean or whatever it is that some of those people fantasize about. I mean, to me, I think the clear reasons for leaving for most people, they might not necessarily use the word sovereignty, but it was basically about decision making at home, democracy, electing the people who make the decisions and being free to kick them out again. And I think that the tangible ways in which people understood that, both inside and outside, the most obvious tangible example was the loss of control with immigration. And I think as part of a story about Brexit, you would have to show that you have properly controlled immigration, which, under Boris and Liz, the direction of travel is the opposite, which I think is kind of crazy in political terms as well as economic and social terms. And then I think it's really about this sort of saying to people, I think, well, if we do exactly the same thing that we were doing before as a member of the EU in economic terms, we will be slightly poorer than we would otherwise have been. So we do have to change, but the ways we need to change are not necessarily about sort of wholesale deregulation. They're about having a more agile state and being able to sort of regulate in a better way, in an earlier way, in sort of emerging and high growth markets. And everyone argues about things like the vaccine procurement policy and so on. That is an example of the kind of agility that we should want. But we need to apply that to things like things like life sciences and regulating sectors like those.
Can I just switch slightly? So one of the things that comes back to your point about active state, Nick, and I'd be interested in others' thoughts on that. So kind of post during COVID, obviously there was an expectation the government would step in, and it always feels a little bit like what happened after the Second World War. There's an expectation of a bigger government, and now during the energy crisis, there's an automatic expectation, might be right, might be wrong, that the government needs to play a very big role. Is that one of the areas where the Conservatives, well, at least the current administration, but maybe also Conservatives are on the sort of wrong side of history? That people, that voters now want a much more active state, to use your phrase, and they want government to provide the answers, and we're still. Well, sorry, if you want to do that, vote Labour. Is that one of the kind of trends that sort of feels like a societal trend that's moved against where we might stand, or do you think your active state solves that?
Is this for me?
Yeah, if you like.
I mean, I think that's true in a kind of electoral sense, in that people aren't ideological about the role of government, and they have expectations of what government should do. So to simply deny that that's one of the purposes of government is a sort of strange way of communicating with your voters. But actually, I think on a more sort of substantive and sort of the policy level rather than a political one, I think this is where we need to be anyway, because the challenges that we face now, whether it's about making sure that we're better at research and development, whether it's about making sure that there are better and bigger domestic capabilities in some sectors of the economy, whether it's about the way we go about trying to rebalance the economy in geographical as well as sectoral terms. You can't do these things without there being some kind of strategy and some kind of active role for government. And actually, there's nothing in Conservative thinking genuine conservative thinking and the historical record of the Conservative Party through decades and decades that says that's impossible. It's only the fairly modern embrace of the small state from Thatcher on that suggests that would be antithetical, and I don't think it is.
Rachel, just taking that theme, is that your
Yeah,
take?
I mean, I don't want to keep harking back to the past, but 2019 got this, right? So it promised more public spending. The kind of banner that was above conference in 2019 was get Brexit done, invest in the NHS, police and schools. The reason the Conservative Party has historically been a very successful party is because it has been, like, to be honest, I think its central belief is that it's better if it can do stuff and therefore be in power than if it can't and shouts in opposition. So I don't think that there is anything inherently unconservative in a somewhat more active state. I do think there was an incredibly missed opportunity to say, because you get this in focus groups, right? Well, they proved in COVID that they can find the money somehow, right? There was this missed opportunity at a moment when I think the public were ready to hear it, to say after COVID, okay, there are going to have to be some decisions as a consequence of this support, and this is what it's going to look like. That wasn't made. And the risk I think we have now is one, it appears as though the budget is the source of all our economic woes. It's not the source of all our economic woes, but it looks that way. And also, and I think this was somewhat true of Osborne, and it risks being true of Hunt, is that the people who are cutting spending appear not only to believe it's necessary, but almost to enjoy it. And that is really catastrophic for a public that don't really understand why it is necessary, and certainly think that it is miserable. I was just getting in a jab there, Danny, because it was all too consensual, I thought.
No, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I don't think that wasn't the vibe. I would disagree pragmatically. I don't think it was the vibe. But I think that I think that's the part of the problem with what Quaggy and Liz tried to do, which is that was the vibe, and it was also delusional, because it was about the idea that we can cut all these taxes and it won't cost us anything, which is just not. People know that's not true. So I very strongly agree with you about the missed moment to persuade people we spent a lot of money on COVID, and therefore it'll be difficult. I think that when Liz Truss blames it all on the war with Putin, she's chosen the wrong thing. People know that we spent a lot of money on COVID, and I not only did I actually try to persuade Rishi Sunak to do that more. And it was part of this sort of drama between him and Boris that he felt he couldn't. But I think he does have the ability to make that point. I spent all that money on it, and now I've got to run it back. He also has the point to raise. Nick framed it very well about the issue of Brexit and how you deal with that. And can I just make one point? You're probably going to get questions in a moment, but about the fact that I'm quite clearly trying to link up the points that we made. I think we've just learned that the kind of nuances that do definitely divide our opinion and sometimes lead us to have a criticism of different people is just nothing by comparison with the bin fire that has now happened, right? And that there is a kind of very broad kind of center of the party. For us to sort of engage in a division that divides your nuanced opinion from mine, either view, is preposterous. And if we do that, the party will end up run by Suella Braverman and Dan Wootton, and it's just, we have to prevent that from happening for the country's sake.
And I guess then, Mark, leading into one of the questions, or because we touched on some of them, which is, what next? I mean, it seems to me the only credible next is a group of people at the top, some kind of, quad or trio that combines the majority of the Conservative tradition together. I don't see how a single candidate in another leadership election now works.
And just so we've got sort of five or six minutes, as you say. I've been taking in some of the questions that have been posed. So imagine we're in a slightly different situation. There's a new leader, and they make the call and say, "Look, I'd like to get a brains trust of the three people on this call." Are there things that you think, okay, my starting point? We've had a wide-ranging discussion about what feels like principles. Are there specific things you could say, well, or one specific thing? So, well, if you're going to do one thing, do this thing and do it well. Start with Nick.
Well, I think the most important thing. So before I say it, I think what Danny said is absolutely right, and I think basically as soon as that budget was introduced, it was really interesting. All the sort of nuanced differences that felt sort of quite significant before suddenly felt like they melted away, and I suddenly felt like the kind of the kind of purpose that a lot of us had back in the 2000s when we were all working in more junior roles. I was a lot littler. The purpose that we had in trying to bring the party together and make us sort of presentable and electable and so on. You could feel that kind of returning, because the party had put itself on a path that was very dangerous and reckless for the country and people's lives, and that's not what we are. To me, I think actually the most important thing is being strategically really clear and to lead through the decisions you make, but also the reasons you're doing them, and to demonstrate your values as often as possible. And we're going to have to take some decisions that none of us should enjoy. We're doing it because circumstances dictate. But that there has to be something beyond that we're doing this in order to be able to do more beyond the immediate pain of the sacrifice. And even as we go through that period of sacrifice, there are still things that we can do that will make things better quickly. So to me, it's about purpose and values, I think. And on what comes next, I mean, I think most of the MPs I talk to now think we're at a point where certainly Liz goes very soon, but that the decision to replace her, there will be no kind of coronation. There will have to be a contest, but that it will be possible to cut out the members, and that it will be done quickly. And to me, that doesn't necessarily mean Rishi definitely wins because he was first among the MPs last time. It won't be the same contest rerun, but I think the person who emerges is quite likely to be the person, as Rachel said, is capable of bringing people together from across different factions. And I don't care about personalities and factions anymore. I just want somebody who can keep the show on the road.
Same question, very good. Same question to Rachel.
Yeah, I'll be brief, and I both agree with what Nick said, and I outlined some policies in the beginning. I think the most important thing that they can do is put people into cabinet positions who can grip the basic functions of the state. It is like one of the most annoying things to me is that Liz Truss sacked basically the only people who knew what the hell they were doing in cabinet positions. Like, if you have any hope, put people who have some experience and know how to grip the basic functions: crime, police, schools, health, so that things don't keep falling apart before you have any chance to do anything new.
Very good. Competence at an individual level. Danny?
Two things. In addition to that was a very good point and completely right. First of all, you have to create a narrative that explains what that integrates Brexit and COVID, the two big things that this government has done, and explains what it does. You have to also be able to to say that the last thing was a mistake. I think it matters a lot that Rishi Sunak be the next leader, because he's the only person that can do those three things, right? He's the only person that can make a narrative out of Brexit, COVID, and the failure, and can to some extent say, I was against the failure and I'm sorry for it, but I was against it. So that is the reason why I think he should do it. So then the second thing I think is you don't want to drop the growth idea, but you want to broaden it. I agree with Nick, actually. You do trying to do something about immigration is very important, although the problem with it is it's just very difficult and very difficult to do, and so it may be you don't want to get into it because it's difficult, but we can talk about that and what we actually do. But I would say you concentrate on kind of universities and leveling up and productivity, and try to make some of these things begin to work, and have a program that seems to be what Conservatives do, which is improve prosperity.
Very good. Just one final question I've just noticed. Someone asked, would it be a good thing if Conservatives had a period in opposition? I still, as someone who managed to stand in 3 elections and not winning any of them, and observe the Conservatives in opposition for 13 years, and you lose an election you might never get back. I find it a depressing argument. It almost accepts that you've lost and that you might be out there, but it almost makes the assumption that you will then be back in again, that you might do a period of opposition for 1 year, 5 years. Well, yeah, but you might never get back. So that's my answer. I don't know if anyone had anything to chip in.
Why would it help? Right. I mean, I was director of policy of the Conservative Party in opposition, and I can tell you that trying to make policy in opposition is really difficult. It doesn't help because it probably detaches you more from reality. If we know what the problem is, why can't we just try and deal with it now? Right.
I mean, this conference this year was the first since I got involved in politics in 2006, where the Conservatives were assumed to lose, and on that basis, it's a lot less fun than when they're assumed to win or are in power. So it doesn't seem to me a desirable thing, but we're going to find out.
Very good. Well, look, thank you so much for all of you. That was an amazing and really interesting discussion. I secretly, of course, I hope that someone somewhere is watching, and that when someone new comes in, they think those 3 people, they seem to have a pretty good grip on it. So thank you so much to all our speakers, and particularly to Rachel for taking time away from her children in Centre Parks in order to be able to appear today. So thank you very much, and thank you for the questions from the audience, and I look forward to seeing you on a future occasion. Thank you very much.